Okay, how's that? Da 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 da. All right, perfect. I just need to turn that sensitivity down a little bit. Da 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 da. Yo doo doo. Perfect. All right. Okay. So welcome back. So I hope you had a good reading week. I spent my entire reading week marking stuff and apparently forgetting how to do things because it's taking me forever to get stuff going today. And I forgot my little lavalier mic, so I'm using my one headphone. So if you're watching online, I'm sorry, the audio quality is probably pretty bad because I never buy really expensive headphones and because I lose them constantly. So yeah, just forgive me if the audio is bad. Okay, so a couple of things I guess I just want to touch on. I just sent out the email like right before I ran over here, and I don't know if that actually went out yet because sometimes it takes a second. Uh, yes. So basically tomorrow, so if you want to review your midterm, I'm going to be in the office tomorrow from about 1 till about 4. So you can just pop by, no appointment needed. Just pop by. I have like, because I'm currently hosting a whole bunch of iPads we're going to be using for research later, but I have like 8 iPads in my office. So if 8 of you show up at once, I give each of you an iPad, you review your exam, and off to the races you go. If you're really unlucky and you're the ninth person who shows up, you get to use my Amazon Kindle Fire. And it's not a great experience, but it works. So you can pop by, yeah, anytime between 1 and basically 4 o'clock. And I'll probably do that again in a couple of weeks. Just have it, maybe I'll do it like on a Wednesday instead for the people who have conflicting things on Tuesday. So not maybe next week, but the week after, I'll do one more kind of review. If neither of those things is going to work for you, you can still send me an email and we can book a time to go over your exam with you. Da-da. To-do. I don't know. You missed. Oh, I will put it up there. I thought I had, but maybe I forgot. Okay. I think that's the only announcement I had to make. Honestly, like we're obviously rounding out the course. We're going through our last few subjects. We got what 3 weeks of the term left, so we're coming already toward the end. Um, are there any sociology courses where students do papers instead of just tests? Yes, they tend to be at the more senior level, so either 300 or 400 level, but you would probably be best to just go in the course catalog and like check the different courses and see what's been offered and what's taught by whom, because I can't remember off the top of my head. All the classes I teach have 100 students or more typically, except for SOS 315, which is Intro to Social Methods, where you write something. It's not a paper, but it's more of a research proposal. And it's, as you can imagine, Intro to Social Methods is almost too exciting to put into words. Um, so I take it at your caution. It might be so exciting that you would lose your mind. Okay, so I guess we're jumping into families as our next topic. Um, Family obviously critical because it is so central to kind of the human condition, right? Everybody more or less is born into some kind of family, right? Obviously there are people who are orphaned, but mostly people are born into some kind of family, whether that be a two-parent married household, single parent or whatever. And it's where you're going to experience a ton of your life is going to be within that context. So in terms of formative social institutions, it's essentially one of the major ones, right? School being the other one, and we're going to talk about education hopefully before the end of the course. Okay, so one of the kind of key ways that marriage has been formed, really, historically now for probably close to 2 or 3 centuries, has been in the context of what we call the nuclear family, right? So the nuclear family, right, is this kind of agglomeration of a married couple, and typically, historically we're talking a man and a woman, male and female, and their biologically related children that kind of function as you know, the nucleus, right, around which the lives of those individuals kind of function. That's why we call it the nuclear family. And marriage historically has been a core kind of part of the nuclear family, right? So when we talk about our different schools of sociology, right? Always the first one we tend to go to is our functionalists, right? So for functionalists, the nuclear family and marriage are really, really important social institutions. Why? Well, for one, they emerged relatively naturally, right? They weren't sort of forced in there by, you know, the state. They emerged kind of as a result of social conditions. Marriage being a really core institution within society for a bunch of reasons, right? For one, it has been historically that socially approved kind of institution, presumably long term, um, institution where, two adults are linked both socially and economically, right? And sexually, and where the sexual kind of relationship between people has historically been legitimated, right? Where basically, sex outside of marriage for a long time was seen as illegitimate, and sex had to be sort of contained within an institution, and that was marriage historically, right? Now, theoretically, at least, it involves kind of reciprocal rights and obligations between spouses, right? So each person is supposed to bring something to the union. Uh, I spent way too much time on YouTube as I was marking things during the break. And for some reason, the like quasi manosphere videos have like fallen into my YouTube Shorts feed, and so I got to experience the joy of just pearly things, um, telling women about what their role as a wife would be and what they were supposed to bring to the marriage. Um, Interesting for someone who's never been married. But anyway, but right, there's supposed to be certain things that socially each partner is supposed to bring. Now, historically, right, prior to really the 1960s, when we get the sexual revolution and the advent of birth control, the idea was, at least, that the male partner would provide the bulk of the sort of funds to support the family by going out and either working on the farm, or working in some kind of factory. And the female partner would be responsible for more of the caring work, right? Taking care of children, the home, and often elderly relatives, right, that need to then come into the home. And that was sort of what each person brought into the union. Now, the sexual revolution sort of explodes all of that, right? Because, suddenly women are having less children. They can control their fertility in much more concrete ways. But we still have this kind of notion that each person is supposed to bring something into kind of a marriage, and that there are kind of rights and obligations that every person in the family has to one another, right? And that parents have a responsibility to care for their children, right? And children have the responsibility to eat you out of house and home. Maybe that's just mine. Okay, so the nuclear family is one form, right? And again, this is typically um, two adult partners and typically biologically related children. That's your kind of nuclear family. Increasingly, right, we're seeing different sorts of family forms that are emerging and becoming more normal. Now, these two are not necessarily new. They've been around, since time immemorial, but I'll just kind of explain them a little bit here. Okay, so we have polygamy or polyandry. And basically, this is where the nuclear family is expanded horizontally, right? By adding more spouses. Now, this has almost always historically been more women, right? So one husband, multiple women, right? This is, I think, one of the fundamentalist kind of Mormon families with sister wives, right? As depicted on shows like Big Love, which I also never watched because people told me it was good, and I was like, you think it's good, whoever you are. I'm not going to watch it. But right, fundamentalist Latter-day Saints had this kind of notion of polygamy, and you see polygamy historically in lots of different societies. It's most typically, right, male, a bunch of women, that's polygamy. You occasionally get, very rarely, polyandry, where you have one woman with multiple kind of male partners. It is extremely rare in human societies for that to be the arrangement, however. So, we don't need to worry about it any time. But basically, the idea is you add, kind of you build the family out horizontally by adding more kind of sexual partners in it, right? And again, typically women. So you would have, sister wives or whatever it happens to be. This is polygamy, polyandry. The extended family, a little bit different, right? So this is expanding it vertically, right? Where you add multiple generations, right? So you expand the nuclear family by adding kind of grandparents, right? So you would add, grandparents coming to live with the family. So now you live in an extended family unit. Maybe aunts and uncles, right, might live cohabit or live close by. Um, multiple people, multiple generations living in an extended family unit. Now, this used to be really common, right? If you go back to the Middle Ages, this would have been the norm where people sort of lived in and around kind of an extended family unit, and members of that family would cooperate with things like child rearing and all of those sorts of things. It became rarer and rarer through the industrial period. We're seeing a reemergence of it now in Canada, particularly amongst certain immigrant groups, where they're coming from places in the world where living in an extended family union is much more common, and bringing that kind of family organization back into Canada through immigration. Now, how long that's going to last, don't know. It could be that a couple generations on, they kind of break back up into nuclear family units, but we are seeing a reemergence of people living in these extended family units, especially grandparents, living in the same home and often caring for small children when the parents are off at work. Okay, so I'm sorry, I need my tea. Did everything, didn't take my tea. There we go. Is it just me, by the way, or is there like now a disproportionate number of chairs in this room? They're like multiplying. Did they have little chair babies while you were away for me? Like every time I come in here, there's more tables and more chairs. I'm like slowly being boxed in, so there's no escape. Uh, it's like why I feel trapped by all the chairs. I know I could just move them, but somehow they feel like a cage. Okay, so there's I think a good argument to be made that the nuclear family is a sort of historical aberration. It emerges, I think, fundamentally from industrialization, right? So it's maybe 200, 250 years old. And the fact that people moved away from like these communities where they would have lived in extended family units, and then, excuse me, on farms where their families had lived on a plot of land for hundreds of years, and moved into cities where they rented apartments, and it was just parents and children that kind of were in this sort of space. And it really hits its apogee, right, in terms of the family form, somewhere in the 1950s, 1960s, after which it goes into a sort of slow and steady decline, right? And there's lots of things that contribute to this. Like sometimes people call the 1950s the golden age of marriage, because marriage rates were at an all-time high. The silent generation, those that had been born kind of in the interwar period but didn't fight in the wars, got married very young. So there's lots of young families with kids. Once you hit the 1960s, you get things like the sexual revolution, women's liberation, and particularly a bunch of divorce laws that basically start to change the dynamics of how people pair up, right? So what we've seen basically is a kind of long-term decline in marriage rates, and this chart is not the right one. This is fertility overview, but we can talk about that as well. But basically, right, we've had a decline in marriage rates over the last, basically 40, 50 years, where basically marriage rates have been declining pretty steadily. Fewer people per thousand are getting married every single year. And when you hit the millennials and Gen Z, the rate declines even further. There was a slow rise in the divorce rate. Basically, like it took a big jump in the 1980s when a kind of divorce called no fault divorce, where basically neither party had to prove that there was, infidelity or abuse happening. You could just say we don't want to be together anymore, and you could get divorced. As a big jump. It kind of jumped up so that about half of first marriages ended in divorce. It's come back down now. It's somewhere around 40% now of first marriages ending in divorce, and it's actually trending downward. Um, one thing to say about this, though, one of the reasons that a lot of demographers think that the divorce rate is now trending downward is that when it comes to younger millennials and Gen Z in particular, they simply are not getting married, right? Um, it's much more common now for people who are younger millennials or Generation Z to get to cohabit for long periods of time, to have kind of, some people call it like serial monogamy, right? Where basically you have a bunch of, you're monogamous for periods with different partners and cohabiting with them at different periods in your life. But marriage has become much less common, to the point where some have started to call it a luxury product, right? Where essentially, like if you look at the working class, much less likely to get married. College educated people are much more likely to get married. And if you make over $100,000 a year, you're much more likely to get and remain married. So it's starting to resemble a sort of luxury product in a lot of ways. But yeah, so it went up kind of, especially in the 1980s, 90s, it kind of peaked and has come down a little bit. Okay, along with that, and I don't know, was I talking in this class about total fertility in Canada? I can't remember. We've seen a decline in the total fertility rate in Canada, right? So basically, how we measure total fertility is a kind of a weird number, but basically it's measured by total children that a woman like on average will have in her lifetime, in her kind of reproductive window, which we set at about 15 to about 44. So 15 years old to about 44 years old, right? So that's roughly the kind of years where you're able to have a child, right? Now this has been declining for a long time, right? So this is the chart that's on here. And you see, right, it kind of peaks out roughly around 1961, right? And this is the year that we kind of typically, somewhere around 1961 to 1963, is roughly when we say the baby boom ended, right? So we have this, this generational cohort that we call the baby boomers, roughly 1946 to 19, depends on who you ask, somewhere between 1960 and 1963. I've seen some people put it as late as 1965. After which, right, when you look at, I didn't bring my pen today. It's also in my other laptop case. Apparently, what happens when your boss buys you multiple devices, you forget which one you're using. But right, you can kind of see. Can I? Oops, I broke everything. Like, can I use my mouse to kind of draw something? I'm gonna try. Right, so right around here, we kind of peak out. Oops, that made a big spike. I don't know why it's doing that. After which the fertility rate basically drops off. Now, not inconsequentially, the early 1960s is when the birth control pill entered Canada. The first kind of official allowed use was to treat female bleeding disorders, after which point, though, in 1968, Canada approved it as a contraceptive. And after that, right, you see the birth rate kind of fall off. So this one ends in 2016. It took a big, so it, where did it end off? About 1.5 children per woman. Um, about 2020, for unknown reasons, we can't say what happened in 2020. Um, no, we know. Obviously, it was COVID. The birth rate dropped even further, right? And today it sits at about 1.3 children per woman. Now, that black line in the middle, right? So that, that it says cohort replacement level. That black line at 2.1 children per woman basically is what we call the replacement rate, right? So if a population is above that rate, it will grow naturally. If it is below that rate, the population will actually decline kind of slowly. And Canada, yeah, has basically entered this kind of weird, super special and elite club of nations, of which there are not that many, um, of what are called the low fertility nations, right? We're in a club with South Korea, Japan. They're worse than we are in terms of their fertility rate. I think South Korea is like 0.083 children per woman. Japan is about zero point 0.9. So hilariously, about 10 years ago in Japan, the sale of adult diapers started to outpace the sale of baby diapers. which is, by the way, just not a good sign for your population. It means you're going through you've entered what's called a demographic death spiral. What other nations? Greece about 1.3, Portugal about 1.3, and I think Spain and Italy are about 1.4. So like on par with Canada. So we're part of a very exclusive club of nations that has decided we hate babies so much that we will simply stop having them and consign ourselves to a slow, meaningless death by lack of people. So, you know, it's fun. All right, no questions. All my jokes. Okay. So, conflict theorists, right? So, our Marxist friends and our critical feminists in particular, often, basically will be critical of how positive functionalists are about the role of the nuclear family. Because at their core, um, functionalists really view the family as the base unit of society, right? The one from which all the rest of society emerges. And if kind of that nuclear family ideal breaks down, functionalists will often, suggest that larger social dysfunction is then to follow. Um, so, what do critical theorists or conflict theorists tend to say about the nuclear family? And this actually goes back, right to the beginnings. Do I have this? I can never tell if I'm getting ahead of my. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of my slide. I was going to tell you about Friedrich Engels, but I'll wait one slide until I have his name on the slide. Sorry, I know all this stuff so much that I can't remember what I put on the slides half the time, or in what order. Okay, but basically, right, the traditional nuclear family is based on a ton of gender inequality, particularly the oppression of women, right? And the control of women and the control of their sexuality and fertility, conflict theorists will say, is baked into the nuclear family. Um, and basically, they'll say that, the kind of breakdown of the nuclear family that we're seeing today is ultimately just a result of the changing power relations between men and women, right? So the fact that we have more divorce today is probably probably a function of the fact that birth control gave women increased economic power, right? Because if you were, through your 20s and probably a good part of your 30s, going to be pregnant and having children and taking care of small children, there was a, 20-year, yeah, well, let's say, yeah, 20-year kind of time period in your life that as an economic actor, you had very little agency, right? Like it was going to be very hard for you to, I mean, women did it for sure, but it's very hard for you to, leave your kids and earn a living as you raise small children or were pregnant, right? Really, really difficult. Birth control obviously changes all of this, right? Women now have fewer children. They can control their fertility in much more concerted ways. And so what do you get? A lot more economic agency, right? And from the 1960s forward, right, you see women entering the workforce much earlier, right? Or re-entering the workforce after having children much more quickly, and having far fewer children, so they're out of the workforce for a lot less time, which means fundamentally they're less reliant on male partners, which means then they're more able to divorce partners that they're no longer sort of happy living with, right? Whereas if you were at home with small children and had no economic kind of potential, right, because there weren't that many roles for women in society economically, it was going to be really difficult. So what conflict theorists will say is as those things shifted, the dynamics of the nuclear family kind of shift with them, right? And so you'll get more divorce because that kind of oppression that existed in the nuclear family of being pregnant all the time and having small children sort of disappears. Okay. So, like I was about to say, and then realized that I have it written on this slide, so I'll say it here instead. This kind of narrative about the nuclear family and the oppression of women fundamentally goes back to the very beginnings of conflict theory, right? So, to specifically Friedrich Engels. So, Engels was, if you don't know, Engels was a friend of Marx. Um, Engels had a rich daddy who he hated, like a lot of people who are rich. So, he had a rich daddy who he hated. And, to take out his rage on his rich daddy, he became a communist and was the guy who essentially funded all of Karl Marx's writing. Because Marx didn't have any money of his own, he relied on his rich friend who had a rich dad to fund all of his, writings and all of his research on, the history of economics and all that fun stuff. So while he's sitting at the library of the British Museum, writing Das Kapital or whatever, um, Friedrich Engels was, giving him money so that he could do that. All of which got Engels included, though Engels, I think, is a mediocre thinker in comparison to Marx. Engels got his name included on things like the Communist Manifesto. There's pretty good evidence he never wrote a word of it. It was all Karl Marx. But Engels wrote his own stuff, amongst which was his kind of communist critique of the nuclear family and of family in particular. And basically, what Engels argued was that the traditional nuclear family emerged along with inequalities of wealth, right? That basically it was fundamentally linked to economics and the capitalist mode of economics in particular. So the nuclear family emerges, and basically the nuclear family is all about two things: controlling women sexually, right, so that men could, assign them subservient roles in society, keep them basically, economically deprived so that they couldn't challenge men, and allow men to pass their property on to their male offspring, principally, right? To continue their patriarchal line or whatever it happens to be, right? So basically, that, women's roles in the nuclear family was all about control, 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 and oppression because men wanted to control the world, and they wanted to control women sexually, so they kept them in these subservient roles. And I mean, this is not an entirely unfounded, I am hard on Frederick Engels um, a little bit, but it's not entirely unfounded either, right? Like if you go back to when he was writing, amongst other things, right, women couldn't hold property, right? They couldn't vote, obviously, because that's a 20th century sort of change in women's rights. So women couldn't hold property, right? Women couldn't inherit the property of their fathers, or in a lot of cases, even their husbands. So they couldn't, until probably relatively late, the 1950s or 60s, open a bank account without the consent of a male relative, either, father or husband. Often couldn't manage their own affairs. These sorts of things. These are not inventions um, of Engels' imagination. Those were real things. So definitely was a sort of, second class citizenship happening. But he says, it's all about controlling them sexually and making sure that only men can continue being powerful and inheriting property. Now, what's his solution? Like all good communists, his solution is eliminate private property fundamentally, right? That if you got rid of the notion of private property, that then women wouldn't have to be consigned to these subservient roles because men would lose the ability to kind of hoard wealth for themselves and pass it on only to their male offspring. Um, I mean, okay, so what are some of the problems with this? Well, gender inequalities exist in non-capitalist societies as well, right? If you go back to feudal Europe, gender inequalities existed. If you go to, say, sub-Saharan Africa, in places that remain, in some ways either quasi-modern or even pre-modern in some cases, right? There are still gender inequalities. Um, so it's not unique to capitalist societies. Even if you had gone to, say, the Soviet Union, there were major gender inequalities in the Soviet Union itself, despite how people have tried to romanticize, the Soviet Union in a lot of cases. Major gender inequalities existed within Soviet society. Men had much more privilege and opportunity, and that was ostensibly, a socialist society, even though never perfectly so. And yeah, I mean, patriarchy deeply rooted in economic, military, and cultural history of humankind. Going back to the fact that, you know, being the sex that doesn't have babies, men were the ones who went off and is physically stronger biologically. Men were the ones that always went off to fight wars, right? And so this has led in a lot of cases, again, despite what I think are some kind of strange fantasies about a pre-modern egalitarian or even matriarchal past that some people tend in anthropology tend to buy into, which I don't think is true. Um, that mostly like human societies for the most part are pretty patriarchal, and it seems deeply rooted in a lot of cultural traditions. There are the rare ones that are matriarchal. It's just not the majority. Um, yeah, and for feminists, only a genuine excuse me, a genuine gender revolution can alter this state of affairs, right? And this very much critical feminism wants to break down a lot of these structures of society to get rid of any inequalities based on gender or even notions of normative ideas of gender at all. I have not. No questions. Okay. Are the questions not working? Has anyone asked a question? Or is it just, I don't know. I don't want to, I'm just going to double check it. Because sometimes recently it has not been working, although it worked at first. I'll go back to the one that worked and see if there's any questions. Doo-doo. Perfect. It works. Good to know. Thanks for that. Okay. So, um, one of the things that conflict theorists and like critical feminists will often talk about is gender divisions of labor and how they ultimately kind of shape people's experiences, right? Um, so, I mean, amongst other things, right, we know that people with more egalitarian views of gender equality tend to divide household chores more evenly. Right, so closer to a kind of 50-50 split, at least initially, right? And yeah, so more people's earnings are equal, the more, people tend to split tasks more equitably. And yeah, I mean, basically what we've seen is, attitudes, right, as kind of feminism has become more normalized, to become more of a powerful force in society, people have divided gendered tasks more evenly. Now, this is true to a point, right? One of the things that tends to still happen, and this is something that feminists are extremely critical of, is that people will divide, domestic tasks more evenly until children appear, right? I mean, they don't just appear, but let's, you know, there's no stork. There was a question about this on the first midterm. There's no correlation between storks and babies. If your parents haven't had this conversation with you, it might be time to ask. Specific children, when they are born, right? Um, Ultimately, what you see is that the split in kind of gender-based kind of divisions of labor tends to get a little bit out of whack again and shift more towards a kind of 80-20 kind of split, right? Where women do 80% of domestic work and about 20% is for, male partners. Okay, so why this happens is pretty obvious, right? Women will be home much more often with children, so they're in the domestic sphere for some period of time. But what is a kind of weird feature is that even couples that were, initially pretty egalitarian, once that split goes to 80-20, it remains kind of stubbornly there, right? And it might even out to like 70-30. But once children show up, there is a redistribution of labor, typically towards, women. So what kind of labor is this, right? This is cooking, cleaning, washing clothes, emotional care for children, and all of those kinds of things, right? So what we would call compassionate work. That tends to be distributed, to women once children arrive on the scene in whatever manner they do. Um, I don't know why I keep saying that. I feel like it should be funnier than it is. Oh well. Uh, so, right, that split tends to be pretty stubborn once it gets put back into place. For whatever reason, people seem to stay in that pattern. And, even things like picking kids up from childcare or taking kids to activities seems to have a much more kind of female dominated kind of bias. All right. Okay. Oh, mate selection. Okay. So we live in a weird time. We live in a very weird time. Um, and why? Why do I say we live in a weird time? Because, fundamentally, most of us in this room, conditioned by bad romantic comedies, from Hollywood, I don't know, maybe that's it. But actually more, it's just from a kind of individualistic, voluntaristic notion that's come to us from the Enlightenment and the Romantic period. Though, just to be clear, the Romantic period has nothing to do with romance, but that's a story for a philosophy class, not this one. Um, we had this kind of notion that we should pick our partners, right? Who we're going to marry and who we're going to make a family with, ultimately for reasons of love, right? Because we love them, because we have a deep affection for them, and so on and so forth. But this is actually a historical aberration, right? Through most of human history, and it seems to be something that really emerges from kind of the West at a particular time, like sometime around the 18th, 19th century. This notion sort of takes over. But historically, right, marriages were arranged by third parties, right? Typically parents, but sometimes, community members, matchmakers, or whatever, who wanted to either, join two families, maximize a family's prestige, give some kind of economic benefit or political advantage, or in a lot of cases and in a lot of societies, it was arranged because you had too many daughters in your family, and daughters were economically less valuable than sons, and you had to find a way to transfer the no, I'm not saying this is true, but this is how it's been historically. You had to transfer the economic burden of your daughters to someone else, right? So this is where the idea of like a dowry comes from. If you've ever heard the term a dowry, where your family would basically marry you to someone and they would pay that person, right, some amount, either cash or some kind of commodity, along with you to kind of, I guess, sweeten the deal. Um, because, right, this is how things were done for a long time, right? Basically, women were married off for kind of political or economic kind of benefits, right? So it would be like, okay, you get Sheila, and along with Sheila, here is three goats, a chicken, and we will transfer you two goats every 2 years, as long as you are married to her, right? Now, if you happen to divorce her for some reason, then the two goats would have to be returned, along with Sheila, presumably, right? So we live in a very kind of strange historical period, right? And still, like, if you go to place, oh, it's too bad we didn't watch that globalization video, because it didn't work that day. But there, the girl who's featured in it, who's from Bangladesh, her parents basically went into debt, basically to give her sister a dowry, and so she went to work in a Joe Fresh factory in Bangladesh, in order to basically pay off her family's debts. So this has been very historically normal, right? Um, and yeah, we didn't really get this idea that women should be able to choose their romantic partners until really, at least the 18th century. So really, it's a relatively, you lucky few in history who've gotten to choose your kind of who you're going to marry. Okay, so man, I should make these. I should put images on these slides. Maybe I'll fix them up for next time so they have fun images. Um, it's not, for some reason, there's not a lot of fun wedding images. It's all like happy cakes or things being destroyed by like a wedding cake being cut into between the bride and groom with a knife to talk about divorce. It's not always the funnest in Google image search. Yeah, social forces will tend to determine who people marry in major ways, right? And I mean, you've had people write about this. I think my favorite book on this is a book called Cheap Sex by a University of Texas at Austin scholar named Mark Regnerus, um, where he talked about, the marriage market in very economic terms, right? But basically, the idea is people bring different things to a marriage market. Um, and often, what we see most commonly is what's called homogeny, right? So basically, um, people tend to marry people who are very much like themselves in terms of race, religion, social class, right? And especially in terms of wealth. People tend to marry within pretty strict guidelines. Now, when it comes to women, women will most commonly engage in either they marry someone from the same class or they engage in what's called hypergamy, where they marry up in social class, right? So they might go from working class to kind of lower or middle class or middle class. But women almost never marry what we call hypogamy, right? Marrying down, right? Women almost never marry down in social class. So when maybe when you're at Chapters or on Amazon and you see that, Harlequin romance novel where, the Countess marries the poor stable boy, that doesn't happen, right? Like maybe in that novel, he has He's wearing like pants and he's ripped and he's Scottish and long hair or something. My mother-in-law loves these books, so they're all around her house. And I was there last weekend, and I just kind of laugh at them. The Scottish guy in a kilt and no shirt always makes me kind of laugh. Um, anyway, me making fun of my mother-in-law notwithstanding, although it is fun. Um, that kind of marrying down in social class almost never happens for women. It's much more common for men to marry down in terms of social class because men value different things. Let us leave it at that. What things do men value? Pretty. Yeah. Typically, on average. They're less worried about kind of economics than is she pretty. Um, okay, so although, again, typically men do marry people of a similar social class because that's who they interact with. Sometimes, people trying to marry across social class lines will, or especially religious lines, will result in, people intervening to prevent the relationships, especially if there's a kind of interreligious component between groups that don't get along. Now, this is much less common today in Western societies, but historically it has been the norm. Like getting married, if one person was Catholic and one person was Protestant, for example, would have been, considerably difficult, and people would have tried to dissuade you from doing such a thing. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I should say about this. I've probably said enough. Okay. So, like I said, one of the things that we're increasingly seeing, particularly with millennials and Gen Z, is the rise of cohabitation and the decline in marriage, right? Now, they aren't exactly coterminous categories, right? And obviously, yes, when people have been cohabiting for long enough, the state will consider you common law. But there's a bunch of things that make them a little bit different. Okay, so what are they, right? Well, on the base level, they're both, sexual relationships and common residence, right? Because typically, if you're married, you're having sex and you live in the same place, and same thing if you're cohabiting, right? Um, okay, how does they start though? Typically, marriages start with some kind of legal proceeding or religious proceeding, right? You go through a ritual and legal authority, right? So when you want to get married, whether you get married, at City Hall, I don't know if that's a thing in Canada, or whether or by a justice of the peace, I guess, or if you get married in a religious congregation, right? There's a legal process that you have to go through. You go get your marriage license at the registry, and the person who is conducting the marriage has to be a person legally permitted to do so. So either a justice of the peace or a religious figure that's been empowered by the state. And there's a ritual you go through, right? And there's papers that you have to sign, right? And witnesses have to be there to sign them as well. And it's all very fancy, and someone takes pictures and all that fun stuff. When people start cohabiting, right, typically starts without fanfare. And in social, like in qualitative social science work on cohabiting, you're asked like, how did you two start living together? And it was like, well, we were dating, and his lease was running out, and he was like, well, should I renew my lease? And you're like, well, I guess it would be cheaper if we lived together, right? Because then we'd only be paying one rent instead of two. So do you want to move in with me? And they're like, well, I guess so. Like, do you have enough space for all my socks? It's like, well, I can clean out a drawer, and that's how it went, right? No, I kid you not. These are the kinds of things that you find in the social science data. It's like this is the kind of script that people went through, and it's typically about kind of financials. Maybe it's like, oh, we want to test things out to see how it's going. Maybe then we'll get married, but it typically starts without a lot of fanfare. Yeah, I mean, typically marriage brings with it clearly defined roles and expectations, right, that are historically passed down, whereas cohabiting couples, sort of have to make things up as they go. There is no real social script around it. And so, what do you do? Um, Marriage is also much more enforceable. It's still a kind of legal gray zone. What happens when people, break up in a cohabiting relationship and how that gets treated? For example, like I had friends, and basically she had her boyfriend move in for financial reasons, but she basically had him sign a sublease, right? So she sublet part of the apartment to him, so that he would have no legal rights to anything if they broke up. Now, it turns out they got married, but this kind of arrangement is often recommended by lawyers if you're moving in with someone and you're the one who holds the principal lease, have them sign a kind of a sublet something to them, so that they have no property rights. Right, property rights are very unclear in cohabiting relationships. Sometimes it's like both of you walk away with anything that you had, when you came in. But like when people have, I've seen really vicious fights, weirdly, over the dog. People got a dog when they moved in with each other, or a cat, and the vicious fight that goes on over Fluffy when they break up, like whose fur baby is Fluffy, becomes this contentious question that actually can go to the courts. All right, I think I'm out of time. I'm out of time. All right, so let's pick it up from here. We'll talk a little bit about, a picture, fun. We'll talk about cohabitation on Wednesday, and keep going through family.